Cek 1 2 3 tes 1 2 3 cek satu. 1 2 3 cek satu. Cek sound cek satu.
To the mini conference 20 years after the reorganization of power in Indonesia, state and capital in an age of polycrisis. My name is Sheila from Asia Research Center, Universitas Indonesia, and I will be your host for today. This event is organized by Asia Research Center Universitas Indonesia, or ARCUE, and we are very honored to have distinguished scholars and experts joining us in this conference today. In the next couple of hours, we will go on to reflect on the enduring influence of the oligarchy framework and its relevance in today's political and economic landscape in Indonesia. To formally open the conference, I would like to invite Dr. Inaya Rahmani, the director of ARCUE, to deliver her opening remarks. Mbak Inaya, I welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Sheila. Hi, Dick. Hi, Faris. It's really nice to see all the friendly faces. I'm Inaya Rahmani. I am the inaugural director of the Asia Research Center. We're a center formed under the pandemic. As today we'll be speaking about how power is reorganized and continues to be reorganizing to the benefit of a small group. Today, on the way from the hotel to Depok, Universitas Indonesia, we had a conversation about how knowledge is being produced, how knowledge on Indonesia is being produced in the past years. Historically, Dick reminded us again that it used to be that Indonesianists and studies about Indonesia were produced in the US, produced in Western Europe and the Netherlands, also in Japan and Singapore, and in Australia. So another joke in the car, because we had a lot of jokes during our way here, looking at the so many infrastructure development that has been built up since the last time Dick was here, looking at how Indonesian urban societies are changing and how much is related to broader capitalist developments. The joke is because if someone told me in 15 years ago that UI would be organizing a discussion about Indonesia in Indonesia, inviting speakers from Australia, those trained in the US, to talk about what's happening here, but also in response to broader changes as we see the rise of right wing populisms all over the world, both in industrialized and early industrializing countries. I forgot my train of thought. Sorry, I can only be myself. So once I've lost the train of thought, I'm stuck in it. So I'm gonna reorganize my thoughts. So the joke is that in football, there's footballs coming home, and now it's a time in the 21st century that Indonesian studies is coming home, because it used to be that discussions about democracy, discussions about class, about the future of work, about gender, is organized in centers outside of Indonesia and in the Asia Pacific. But we would also like to introduce ARC within the broader development of knowledge production in Asia, because we also are careful in partnering with people in other countries to make sure that we're understanding ourselves well and explaining ourselves well to the world. I remember my train of thought. If someone 15 years ago, because that was when I started working in UI, told me that such a workshop, such a conference is going to be organized by several people, early career, mid careers who had been educated abroad and going home in UI, to UGM, but also to Muhammadiyah, to Tadolako, to Semarang, to Malang, I would believe them. But what I would not have believed is the fact that they've actually become friends. We share personal stories. We share a common purpose together under this neoliberal setting in which employment is becoming increasingly casualized. So we bring in our own resources to make sure that our work is meaningful. So with that, I would like to set the frame of what ARC wants to achieve by connecting past work, a very important structural work about Indonesia, so that we as early mid-careers can look at our work in relationship to broader debates, older debates, so that we can imagine a future that is not only reactive to changes, but also build a kind of knowledge, modes of knowledge production that benefits the disenfranchised rather than a handful of elites. So that's the sentiment and the reason that we're coming together today. Very happy to hand over the stage to Sheila again and then to Faris. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Mainaya. And now we will begin our first session, the keynote session by Professor Richard Robison, who is here with us today. Chairing the session is Professor Faris Al-Fadat from Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta. I will just give a very short introduction of Professor Faris. Feel free to introduce yourself again later, Prof. Professor Faris Al-Fadat is a professor of international political economy and vice rector for student, alumni, and AIK affairs at Universitas Muhammadiyah Yogyakarta. He earned his PhD in politics and international studies from Murdoch University, Australia, and was a postdoctoral fellow at Korea University. His research focuses on international political economy, regional economic governance, and capitalist transformation in East and Southeast Asia. Prof. Faris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Asia Research Center Universitas Indonesia, for hosting this wonderful event. Inaya, Tika, Tricia, and everyone. Good morning, everyone. Having Professor Richard Robison here today at this conference is a truly special occasion, not only because his work with Professor Vedi Hadis, Reorganizing Power in Indonesia, is the central point of our discussion today, but due to his broader intellectual contribution to the studies of Southeast Asia's political economy for the last 40 years. When his seminal book, Indonesia, The Rise of Capital, was published in 1986, Indonesia experienced a rapid economic growth with a public optimism at the same time. At that time, industrialization was accelerated, full with oil revenues and foreign investment. Robison opened his book by saying, I quoted, "The most revolutionary force at work in the third world today is not communism or socialism, but capitalism." This statement remains strongly relevant, especially today. So the development of capitalism in Indonesia and Southeast Asia became the background of Robison's work. Based at Murdoch University's Asia Research Center in Western Australia, he played a pivotal role in advancing discourse on the political economy of Southeast Asia, along with his colleagues, Richard Higgett, Gary Roden, Kevin Hewson, Vedi Hadis, and Kanishka Jayasuriya. Different from conventional approaches that focus on area studies, dependency theory, and orthodox economy, Robison introduced perspective that underscores the inevitable link between capitalist transformation and the dynamic of power. His analysis foregrounded relationship between the state and capital, class conflict, and oligarchic structure. This contribution very well documented in 3 volumes of the political economy of Southeast Asia, which published in 1997, 2001, and 2006, edited with Gary Roden and Kevin Hewson. Over time, this scholarship very well known now as the Murdoch School of Political Economy. In collaboration with Hadis, Robison advanced the study of Indonesian political economy, particularly in conceptualizing the oligarchy and power. Since the publication of their book in 2004, discussion on Indonesian politics are continually engaged with the concept of oligarchy. Remarkably, even politicians and government officials frequently reference to oligarchy in various forums, in online platforms such as YouTube podcasts, often unaware that they are pointing fingers to themselves. I first met Dick Robison 11 years ago when I just started my PhD in 2014 in February. along with other doctoral students, we have a privilege to engage with his ideas in seminars and public lectures. But one moment I still remember today is that when we have a coffee shop discussion in Fremantle in 2018, I just received my PhD, and 1 week before I leave Perth for good, he shared his profound reflection on Indonesia. He believed that Indonesia will change very much in many ways in the current global shift. But one thing that will never change for a very long time is the oligarchic force that will shape Indonesia's economic and politics in the future. Please join me in welcoming to this seminar Professor Richard Robison.
I think I can use this. Can everyone hear me? Is that right? Good. Well, I'm really delighted to be back in Indonesia. I haven't been here recently as often as I'd like, but in the car on the way from the airport, I was talking to the person who came to pick me up, I forgot, and telling her about, well, Indonesia's changed. When I first came here, I used to ride around in becaks and bimos and helichucks, and when you got on the bus drivers would race each other down Jalan Tamarin to get to the next bus stop first. So I shouldn't tell those stories because people realize that I'm not a very young man anymore. This is the problem. Now, let me say, apart from being delighted to be back in Jakarta, but also here at UI, which has always been a great center for intellectual ferment and discussion and production here in Indonesia, but also at the Asia Research Center at the center. And I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's a great privilege for me. And in particular, I think I'd like to thank Inaya and Tika and Trisha for organizing the conference. And it's been done incredibly efficiently. I managed to be able to get here without getting on the wrong plane or catching the wrong taxi and that. And it's good to see so many people here that I've known for quite a while, particularly Faris. Thank you very much for agreeing to be the chair of this session. And I must say that I was also delighted to see an old friend of mine, Luki Jani, here, looking fit and well again, ready to leap into work. I think this is a great initiative, this conference, as Anaya was saying. Nowadays, there are so many books and journal articles and that written by Indonesians. I think a real critical mass has been developed. People coming back from overseas, coming back to Indonesia, or working in relation to Indonesia, really building up a strong center for the study of not only Indonesia, but Southeast Asia and all of the theoretical issues related to it. So it's great to be here. Now, when I was asked to give this address, the topic was Southeast Asian capitalisms after the neoliberal crises. And I thought, well, how do I begin to talk about this? First of all, Southeast Asian capitalisms, there's so many different. How do you compare the Philippines with Cambodia? Or I decided to cut Singapore and Vietnam out of this particular talk. They're so different. But my first problem was, how do I get a common theme How do I find something that makes a discussion about Southeast Asian capitalism coherent? And what I did was to say, well, one thing that is common to all of the countries is that over the past 2 or 3 decades, we've seen the gradual forging of a system of oligarchic power, social power, economic power. And this has been a determining factor, I think, in shaping the way in which Indonesian capitalisms have moved and shifted. And here I'm talking about capitalisms not in a narrow sense, but capitalisms as a system of social and economic power. And then we come to the problem then, and I'll talk more about oligarchy, but Vedi's going to talk a lot about it later on. Then we come to the problem then of neoliberal crises. Everyone's talking about a post-neoliberal era. Is there really a post-neoliberal era? And what are the crises that oligarchy is facing in relation to neoliberalism? And I think there are 3 crises that are facing and 3 ways in which oligarchy is shaping the way we get out of those crises. And one of the crises is the crises of unregulated capitalism. We've seen the Asian financial crisis, the global financial crisis, the deindustrialization of major Western powers, particularly the United States. We're seeing the results of that today. And the question there is, what then is the relationship between oligarchy and neoliberalism? Is neoliberalism dead, or is oligarchy forging a new relationship with neoliberalism, a different sort of relationship? The second crisis of neoliberalism, I think, is what we might call the Polanyian crisis. Polanyi wrote about unregulated capitalism unleashing fabulous growth, but then destroying itself and destroying the society in which it emerged, enforcing what he called a double movement, and that is a movement of political movements that emerged to try and repair the damage to the societies. I suppose Franklin Roosevelt was one, and the New Deal in America. That's a typical example. But of course, the double movement can take a bad form too. One could say that Adolf Hitler was a double movement, a reaction to the unconstrained capitalism and the war in Germany. And the third crisis of neoliberalism is the global economic crisis, that by unleashing globalization of investment and finance and everything, the neoliberalism created a destructive global financial world that now is resulting in America in a reversion to inward-looking policies, trade wars, and a mercantilist view of things. Okay, so what I'm going to argue here is that I'm going to look at how oligarchy has been affected by and shaped these different crises, and how they do it in a way to try and reorganize their own power within these new systems. Just a few words on oligarchy before we go on. Everybody talks about oligarchy, but I think a lot of people mean different things by it. Some people, when they talk about oligarchy, think of, I mean, oligarchy is more than a ruling class. It's more than just a ruling class. It's more than an elite. It's more than crony capitalism. It's more than rule by the rich or rule by a few. Oligarchy in the way I look at it and the way Vedi and I have looked at it in our work, is a social order, an order of social and economic power and political power with its vested interests and beneficiaries. Oligarchy, but it's more than that. It's about the melding of power and wealth as well. Oligarchy is what happens when wealth becomes entwined with rulership in a coherent way, when public authority becomes the possession of private interest. And finally, about oligarchy, we can't get away without talking about our friend Donald. Oligarchy, and remember when he took power, there were warnings that America is heading towards oligarchy. Really, America had been in one way or another an oligarchy since the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, with the Rockefellers and these people, and then the oligarchs of the post-war period in coal and gas and oil, and then the neoliberal oligarchy based in banking and finance, and now a system of oligarchy that's revolving more around high tech and communications, the Musks and the Peter Thiels of this world. So oligarchy can take many forms, and it can change over time. It's a system rather than a particular description. Now, I want to go on and just talk about the three different crises, neoliberal crises that oligarchy has faced. And the first of these is after the crisis of unregulated capitalism. I think that what we've shown was that the crises, the financial crises, showed the limits of what happens if you let it all go loose. If you take away regulation, you open the doors for investors and that to come in, you are asking for trouble. And this is what happened in the global financial crisis and the Asian financial crisis. These ended up in huge bankruptcies, closing of banks, a collapse of financial systems. In Indonesia, for example, under Suharto, everybody had a bank. Every conglomerate had a bank, and there were dozens, if not hundreds, of banks operating. But because there was no regulation, they were just used as piggy banks for distributing cheap money to the rest of the companies. Well, this all came to a head in 1997, I think, just about, and fed into the collapse of the Suharto regime itself. Was this the end of oligarchy? This is the question I think that we were asking, Vedi and I, when we wrote The Reorganisation of Power. This system of oligarchy that had been developing and consolidating itself under Suharto, could this survive any longer? How could it? Would the governments of the region have to abandon neoliberal policies? Well, the answer is the relationship changed. The countries of Southeast Asia have in some ways abandoned neoliberalism, and in the United States and the Western world. For example, they've abandoned fiscal austerity to a large degree. Every country now in the Western world and is spending more money and to try and get out of the crisis, to try and get out of COVID. The state has grown; it hasn't shrunk. But the problem is, of course, that the countries of Southeast Asia still needed investors. They still had to keep the doors open to investment. neoliberalism and the banks themselves rescued the oligarchs in all the countries of Southeast Asia, bailing them out in debt equity swaps and things like that. So oligarchy needed neoliberalism in a practical way, but it needed only a part of neoliberalism. It needed that part of neoliberalism that opened the doors for capital to flow, but it dispensed with that area of neoliberalism that focused on good governance, regulation, and that aspect of neoliberalism pushed by the World Bank and that has faded away. Neoliberalism survives. The reports of its death have been greatly exaggerated. And there's two structural reasons. First is that neoliberalism, in contrary to Fukuyama, doesn't necessarily mean liberalism or democracy. Neoliberalism, as Hayek and Friedman would argue, fits easily with autocracy, as they found particularly in Chile, but also in Indonesia. Authoritarian rule in the view of Hayek can insulate markets from politics. It can insulate markets from organized labor, welfare, and environmental lobbies, and let the markets get on with what they're supposed to do. And the second structural relationship between neoliberalism is the relationship between neoliberalism and oligarchy. Deregulation opened the door for private investors in banking, finance, low taxes. Privatization enabled vast transfers of public wealth into private hands. I mean, this is most dramatic in Russia with the shock therapy and the creation of the oligarchs or the consolidation of oligarchy in Russia. But it's also happened in Thatcher's Britain, where the neoliberal government of Thatcher virtually sold off the North Sea oil and sold off public housings, ran down the national health system and national schools, privatized things, opened the door for all these private companies to come in and take over. So that the point is that when we talk about the end of neoliberalism, the neoliberal crisis, I think we need to say that neoliberalism lives on in parts, and that it is strongly linked it can be strongly linked to oligarchy. It can be strongly linked to authoritarian rule. The next question is, how does oligarchy deal with the crises of what Polanyi would call a double movement? That when unregulated capitalism creates bankruptcies, financial collapses, deindustrialization, is this an invitation then for reformist forces to come in and try and restore order? And how does oligarchy deal with that? Aren't they part of the problem? Well, for example, in the post-crisis period in Southeast Asia, we had a whole lot of new democratic challenges. For example, we saw the growth of the democratic movement in Myanmar and the retreat of that very narrow military regime, a gradual opening of the door to a more democratic way. And they kept their eye on Indonesia. I was teaching in Myanmar for a brief period, and people would come, and often from the military, and say, how did Indonesia do it? How did Indonesia have a soft landing after Suharto without a revolution, without destroying the military? They wanted to know how to make a transfer to democracy that didn't change things too much. In Indonesia, of course, we have Reformasi, the fall of Suharto, you know, the rise of a vigorous parliamentary system. In Thailand too, people were saying, well, at last, after the crisis, this is the end of those periodic military coups. Well, so along. But it didn't happen. As we see, you know, in most of these cases, there's been a walk back from those early days of a double movement. Why has this happened? Well, I think one is the inherent weakness of reformist movements, the inherent political and social weakness. When, for example, in Indonesia, when Reformasi came, did we see a powerful Labour Party? No. Did we see any party with a strong reformist agenda? No. I mean, the parties remained remarkably similar to what they were in the Suharto period. Reformasi has been driven largely by progressive middle classes and students and social movements outside the state. And they all have an inherent weakness. One is that the students and middle classes don't have a big social base. There's been no connection with, say, organised labour or organised peasant movements. And social movements never get their hands on the levers of state power. They're always excluded and on the outside. And this is a pattern that has repeated itself through the region, with the exception, I suppose, of Thaksin in Thailand, who led a populist movement and introduced lots of welfare reforms and that, but ultimately, as it turned out, to be more of an internal struggle within the oligarchy that didn't challenge the foundations of oligarchy. And certainly in the Philippines, with Duterte, again, it was largely an internal struggle within the oligarchy, where people from the edges of oligarchy challenged the old central families. Again, it didn't lead anywhere. Reformer. So the other part of it is that the fact that the oligarchy and the state was remarkably effective in reorganizing their power, rebuilding a political shell for themselves. One way in which it happened was through military coups, like in Thailand, in Myanmar, and of course Cambodia, which has descended into almost a criminal state. The other is populism. Well, we find populism, the oligarchy trying to consolidate itself with populist appeals. In Malaysia, we find the Bumiputra issue is a central issue that's kept power in the hands of an oligarchy for decades. Duterte and Thaksin, we've talked about. Thailand, the monarchy. But nobody has approached Modi's populism in India. The use of populism in India, I think, is, and the use of Hindu nationalism, the Muslim enemy within, you know, nothing like that has happened elsewhere. So that we could say that populism really has not played the central role in maintaining the power of oligarchy. The organic model has been something that's like we could say that Sukarno's guided democracy is one of the clearest examples of the organic model, and maybe we can see that idea still continuing through Indonesia in particular more strongly than maybe other countries. But the other model is the Orban model. And the Orban model, you know, in Hungary, Orban was a former reformer. He took over power and he uses democracy. He calls himself an illiberal democrat. It's called an illiberal democracy. So the methods of controlling power through a democracy include manipulating and controlling elections, partly through money politics, but also through other means. The control of public office, filling public office with political supporters, the use of rewarding of cronies, that is contracts, tenders, and that to supporters of the regime. And here we have to go back to Trump again. Is Trump moving towards the Orban model? He admires Orban greatly. And if we look at the Heritage Foundation Project 2025, it's a blueprint for emptying the whole state, deconstructing the administrative state, closing down things like US aid and that, but in all other areas from defense and that, emptying them of career bureaucrats, filling them with political appointments. So you've got something with a shell of a democracy there, the institutional shell of a democracy, but controlled by within a system of oligarchy. Now, the final challenge that oligarchy is facing is the reorganization of the global economy. The reordering of the global economy from one reliant on the rules of the World Trade Organization to bilateral deals, to system of mercantilism where tariffs become an instrument of war, of policy, where things are done through deals. And this is where we can see Trump changing American policy. The question is, in this world, can oligarchy survive? For example, to survive in this world, what happens to rentier capitalism? People who live off rents, people who live off getting contracts but not actually engaging in production itself. For Southeast Asia to survive in this new world, will they have to? Every country in Southeast Asia has great plans. If you look at the plans for almost any country, including Indonesia, what are they? They want to move out of reliance on resources. They want to move downstream to more and more sophisticated processing of resources, into manufacture, building car batteries, building electric cars, not just assembling, but building cars, getting into medical technology and research, getting into quantum computing, or in other words, all of these plans to move into this high level area. Can this happen with an oligarchy, within a system of rent seeking in particular? It's maybe possible to have an oligarchy that is not rent seeking, but rent seeking has been the basis of oligarchy across Southeast Asia. Will the demands of making a new place in the world economy mean that rentier capitalism has to go? Well, the big question here, and this really isn't central to it, that everyone is asking, can Southeast Asia repeat what Northeast Asia did and move out of low value added into high value added production? Well, if you look at Northeast Asia, there are probably two preconditions. One is they already had the countries already had large manufacturing bases: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, China. They were at a fairly basic level, but they were there. And second, they had a state that was autonomous of business to a large degree. There was certainly corruption, and there were certainly business-government relations, but the state was powerful enough to say, this is our plan. Business can flourish if it fits in our plan. If you don't get, the state subsidies, the state funding, all the inputs that the state can put in, the tariff protections and so on. The problem facing Southeast Asia is, can a state in Southeast Asia have that degree of autonomy where it can set the plan and business falls into that plan? Or does oligarchy control things and the state just become a source of rents? So in other words, will Southeast Asia fit into the new global order in much the same way as it has? And if there is manufacturing and of a high tech level, will it be done by overseas powers, and will oligarchy fit into it as the collectors of rents, as suppliers? For example, the big new industrial projects in Indonesia, who will supply the coal, the energy to it? Who will supply the contracts, the licenses and that sort of thing? Will it be a repetition of the same sort of thing? Now, just moving on to a last point, the question is there a way out of this? What are the people say, what can we do? Well, I think the important thing is to have a look, are there fractures in this sort of system, in this system of oligarchy, and the way they're attempting to? Well, of course, there's fractures in it. We've already talked about the possibility of a reformist reaction, Polanyi's double movement. Is there a possibility for movements coming in and addressing social grievances and economic grievances? Well, I think we just, can we see business, a fracture between business and a rentier state? Is it possible that business will demand more predictable rules, more certainty, and a resistance to paying rents or collecting rents as a means of doing business? Will this increase with joint ventures with foreign companies? And finally, can we see conflicts between rentier capitalists and public officials and their political allies as the new global economy takes shape? We see this in Indonesia in struggles over national industry policy, struggles over mining regulations and industrial regulations. Now, I've probably fitted in too much in one short paper. What I intended to do essentially was not produce a definitive conclusion, but to open up a whole lot of questions. Firstly, to say, what sort of questions should we be asking? What do we mean by neoliberal crises? What do we mean by an oligarchy, and how is oligarchy shaping the resolution of these crises? And finally, what do we see in the future? Can we see any changes, or just more of the same? So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we've got a lot of questions and dissent and that. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dick Robison, for the refreshing insight on talking about the three crises of neoliberalism that have been faced by oligarchy, in which the last one currently happening within the shift of global economy. We would like to open for questions. We will and one question later from the participants online. Please raise your hand and say your name and straight to the questions. One, Luki, and then two. Okay. We'll take two for now. Okay. First question. Yeah.
First one.
Yes.
Hai, selamat pagi, Pak Dik. It's good to see you again for after so many years. Actually, I would like to ask two questions. First, it's in regards to the your last slide. You mentioned about fracture in oligarch community or oligarch networks. If we could see in Indonesia at the moment, the current administration has their own crony, as previous administration always did. And we can see one of the striking new kids on the block was an little, not a little, maybe, a new oligarchs from South Kalimantan who now climb up the ladder into the national level. And this could make other oligarchs jealous. And I think this might create a tension among oligarchs camps. And we should see how the new president or the current president handle or manage this tension among oligarchs. As we could see from the Sokpol publication that the oligarchies become one of or the most important feature that could make the transition of from the new from the previous administration to the new administration could go smoothly. So I think that we should see how the current president able to handle all these different and competing interests of oligarchs. And my second question is, actually, I wanted to ask you about the Vietnam, one of the fastest growing countries in this region. Vietnam now embarked to the more and more capitalistic feature of economy. Many say they have so-called the social capitalist model. And I was wondering, is there any oligarch in Vietnam? Is there any, or not crony capitalism, but maybe crony socialism in Vietnam? As in Russia, during Boris Yeltsin era, he has friends, oligarch friends, that could transform Russia into more modern industrialized country, but it didn't happen. But if we look at Vietnam at the moment, they are fast growing economy and they are above of other countries in this region. So what do you think of them? Is there any oligarch in Vietnam who become an engine of their growth?
Thank you. Thank you, Mas Luki. Dick, you want to take another one question or you want to answer? All right. Yep. Okay. Next one. Oh, you want to answer these two questions first?
Yeah,
All right.
I can't remember more than two questions. That's very quickly on your first question. We've got to distinguish between conflicts within a system of oligarchy between different oligarchs, which might change the guard, but it doesn't change the system. And I think that might be what's happening here and what is always happening. It's a different challenge when the very underpinning of the whole system of oligarchy is challenged compared to, who fighting over who gets what. The other question about Vietnam, one of their problems I didn't mention when I was doing this address is that certainly don't have, and I don't know many people who have the knowledge of the whole of Southeast Asia, to be able to, I can pull pieces here and there. I tell you the truth, I don't know a lot about Vietnam. I know a bit more about Russia just by, reading a lot about it. And of course, there's different systems of oligarchy. Well, where the state can play a different role, like in Putin's Russia, those oligarchs in the system of oligarchy have to fall into line to do what Putin wants them to do. And as long as they do that, they get it. Whereas in some other systems of oligarchy, it's more like cowboy, like under Trump now, whereas we're not sure what the state can do except punish and reward, but it can't manage and control oligarchy. And of course, here we have the difference between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And I think it'd be interesting to categorize different sorts of oligarchy. There is an oligarchy which is totally structural, where the power of these big corporations is structurally imposed on the state. The state needs revenues, the state needs employment, the state has to facilitate business, and that. It's different to the more intimate relations where powerful oligarchs within this system of oligarchy actually control parts of the state. And someone was saying, well, this can't be an oligarchy because there are no oligarchs in the government. Well, oligarchs are too busy doing more important things than becoming politicians and bureaucrats. Sometimes they do, but not often. So I hope that.
Okay, thank you. Next to the second questions, yes.
Which one, bro?
The back one. Yeah.
The back one.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. My name is Nandito, and I have 3 questions. I'm so I'm so sorry if one of my questions is addressed to Mr. Faris, if I may. Of course, Professor Richard also can answer. The first one, for Mr. Faris, I've read your books about ASEAN and the regional architecture order, and it is also one of the answer about how oligarchy responds to financial crisis. To sum up, I think the conclusions of your books say that ASEAN is the internationalizations of oligarch, right? So my questions about ASEAN is how, for the progressive movement, should view ASEAN? Should we just, okay, this is just another oligarch system and we should abandon it? Or, well, we can see some fractures and we can take it. Yeah, that's the first question. The second one is, I think one of the trends, in international political economy is also the rise of these new terms, state capitalisms, which is proposed by Ilyas Alami, and I think most of the late industrializing states is sometimes and somehow is named as state capitalism development, which means state become the active actors in market, becoming the promoters, not only the regulators, but also actors in case of state-owned enterprises and etc. So my questions to Professor Richard Robison: what do you think about these new trends? Yeah, is it just another name for oligarch? Yeah, or it is the new things, and we can expect something more about these trends? Because I see you say that about how about national industrial policies. Yeah, I think this is also one of the trends. And the second one, to Professor Richards.
Yeah.
Uh,
Straight to the question, please.
okay,
Okay, yeah.
I'm sorry. I think all of you just said about how powerful is oligarch.
So yeah, you mentioned about
And
the state strong intervention, right?
yes.
Okay, yeah.
The question is how the progressive movement should react for these powerful and systems. I think
Okay.
that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mas Nandito.
Yeah.
I think it's better to address you on the second question, how the states, how the social activists would respond to the strong state. Yeah.
Okay, I think that the last question was how do social movements respond to strong states, and the previous one was about how state capitalism, the new form of oligarchy. Yeah, well, I think that it depends. Just briefly, state capitalism can feed into oligarchy, or it may not. It may be a genuine state capitalism where the state runs the economy and owns the economy and makes decisions about the economy. Depends whether the state capitalist enterprises are just used as rents by powerful private interests. You know, for example, getting the licenses and concessions and that. So, but I'll leave that one there. What can progressive forces do in a situation like this? Well, you find that progressive forces come to the fore generally at times of crisis. It's very difficult to the answer is to, and I mean, if I was advising the Democratic Party of the United States, and I think they need some advice at the moment, and that is that you have to build structures from below, build sort of, but not just social movements that operate outside, but movements that aim to play a part inside the political system, inside the political parties, get into the parties, you know, try and get social attention. Well, of course, the other thing is, of course, what we're doing, what universities are doing, and some parts of universities are doing is to keep telling a story and don't let don't fall into or allow powerful interests to dominate the discourse of society, to make sure there is another one, because sooner or later it'll come to the surface again. But it's very difficult, you know, it's a long-term thing, and nobody hopes for a big crisis to come along and throw everything and create an opportunity. But that's how most progressive movements get into power, when crisis destroys the system of autocracy or oligarchy.
Thank you, Dick. We have 5 more minutes left. In address to the first question, I will not answer, might not be able to answer, but this is related to Dick's 3 first volumes of political economy that was edited in 1997, 2001, and 2006. But the 4th volume was came in 2020. It's called the 4th edition of Political Economy of Southeast Asia. I think it's very much was talking about what you asked about, the fractions of capitalism in Southeast Asia. Okay, maybe we'll take another one question from the audience and one question from Zoom online. Okay, one question only. Here, all right. Okay, the last one who raised hand over there. Sorry. All right. Yeah. I hope you going to. Oh no, you raise your hand. Yes. Yeah. Over there. Yeah. If you mind, please straight
Hello.
to the questions. Yes.
Hi, Professor. My question is regarding the interaction between oligarchy and democracy. So I think you mentioned that democracy is very much like an empty shell in a context whereby the oligarchy is powerful. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are in terms of like, what are some of the ways in which democracy can somehow constrain or even make oligarchy less damaging, even though there isn't a real democratic process. But sometimes the rituals of democracy can somehow play a part in constraining some of these predatory oligarchy behaviors. I'm keen to hear your thoughts on like this aspect of like to what extent can the democratic context in some way put restraints on oligarchy power.
Okay, thank you. Your name, please?
Jefferson.
Jefferson. All right. Oh, you want to take the last one?
Just one. I'll just quickly answer this one. When you talk about democracy versus oligarchy, I think we need to think of oligarchy as a system with its own social order and a system of power and the way power is operated and organized and the relationships between public and private. So talk about oligarchy as a system rather than just focusing on oligarchs within the system. And the second thing with your question is talking about democracy and oligarchy. Well, when most people talk about democracy versus oligarchy, they're talking about liberal democracy. Liberal democracy with, individual rights, human rights, freedom of the press. Well, Orban says, yes, I'm a democracy too, but it's a different sort of democracy. It's an illiberal democracy where people get to vote as long as they vote the right way, and public office is filled with people that will support the regime. Business licenses will go to the supporters of the regime, but it is a democracy, so they claim. And of course, Sukarno talked about guided democracy. So I think we need to put something before democracy and make it specific when we're talking about that. And
okay, you want to take the last one? Okay.
Was,
yes.
She's been trying to get a question.
Yeah.
Okay, Prof, my name is Irda. Regarding the neoliberalism, oligarchy, and the state, in your view, is this a failure of neoliberalism or more about how state has facilitated the economic concentration of economic power? Thank you. Is this the failure of neoliberalism, or is this about the state that has facilitated the concentration of economic power?
Okay, so is this, you're saying, is this about neoliberalism or about?
Yes, regarding the neoliberalism, oligarchy, and the state, is this about the failure of neoliberalism as a concept, or this is just the state that corrupt?
Well, I think, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that neoliberalism, if you look back to Hayek and those people, really was a continuation of the old idea of laissez-faire, basically. Although, Hayek and those people did talk about social welfare to some degree. So neoliberalism, if we just say, look, it's a broad laissez-faire approach to things, but with some governance tacked on. Is it it's a relationship between the state and neoliberalism, and I think that it's changing. So that if you look in Southeast Asia, the World Bank is still active. You look at the omnibus legislation. That's interesting because on the one hand, it has some highly nationalistic objectives and policy moves, but on the other hand, it opens the door wider for, business to. It places limits on the degree to which labour and environmental movements can obstruct business. It makes investment easier. So in other words, it's a neoliberal document. On the other hand, it's got constraints on neoliberalism because it wants to shift out of the processing world. If neoliberalism was pure, all Indonesia would do would be to chop down trees and dig up coal, a bit like Australia. But so there's always that tension. There's always that tension between the two, and there is a tension. See, oligarchy has to fight not only within itself for power, but the system of oligarchy has to reorganize itself in the face of various challenges too. So I hope that sort of answers your question to some degree.
All right. I think that's the end of our session. And please join me. Thanks, Richard Robison, for this wonderful session. Get back to the MC.
Okay. Thank you so much for Professor Richard Robison and Professor Faris. Before we end the session, we would like to just have a photo time of the speakers and chair for our photographer, please. And after this, we will, that is the end of session 1. Let's have photo time first. Okay, thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for our speaker and chair. And that is the end of session 1. We will move on to session 2 right away. Session 2 is public lecture by Professor Vedi Hadis. We will take around 5 minutes of transition time, but I hope that all of the attendants could kindly stay here and stay tuned for session 2. But of course, if anyone would like to go to the toilet, feel free to do so. Just letting you know that we are starting session 2 right away. Tes, tes. Good morning to all participants and attendants. We will start the session in a few minutes, so kindly take your seats. Kindly take your seats and thank you. Apa?
Kalau yang datang dekat rumah disiplin banget, jangan buat presentasi aja. Bang ada ulang-ulang lagi aja.
Kalau ini tadi elektronik jadi aku nggak merasa perlu. Jangan, jangan. Pak Fedi lagi foto. We will begin the session in a few minutes. Kindly take your seats, everyone. Thank you.
Iya, kan ngomongnya berdiri kali ya, nggak usah ikut podium ya. I hate this thing.
Merasa dengan manual. Jadi kan aku nggak. Oke. Itu 30 menit ya?
Iya.
Good morning to all guest speakers and participants. Let me welcome you again to the mini conference 20 years after the reorganization of power in Indonesia, state and capital in an age of polycrisis. I would like to thank all of you who still stays with us until this noon. We will now begin our second session. It is a public lecture on 20 years after reorganizing power in Indonesia by Professor Vedi Hadis, who is with us today. And chairing this session is Professor Amalinda Safirani from Universitas Gajah Mada or UGM. I will give a short introduction of Professor Amalinda, and feel free to introduce yourself again later, Prof, if you would like to. Professor Amalinda Safirani is a professor in the Department of Politics and Government at Universitas Gadjah Mada, or UGM, and the head of the Polgov Research Center for Politics and Government. Her research interests include social movements among marginalized groups, such as urban poor communities, labor movements, and women's political participation in Indonesia. She has held fellowships at Australian National University and the University of Melbourne, and has conducted qualitative research for international development agencies. To Professor Amalinda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. We've been having some warm up this morning, so let's continue discussing and talking about this topic. 20 years of, maybe we can say, theory of oligarchy. Even though there's Motar Riyadi here in the podium, so we also have a spirit of oligarchy in our room, including this building, I noticed. So that's really the nice thing about discussing about this topic, because it's just everywhere, including, maybe including in this building. So we have around 60 until 70 minutes. Professor Vedi Hadis will have around 30 minutes, and then continue by Professor Markus Mietzner from the ANU. Let me just quickly, I know you all, Professor Vedi Hadis and Markus, right? So, but the reason why this is the panel together, I think we're going to talk about the Murdoch School versus ANU School, right? So this is very, very important discussion. One is political economy oriented with the Murdoch School, and one no, let's just make it equal. So ANU School of Thinking Political Science, Professor Ed Aspinall is there, Markus Mietzner, and before that, almarhum Howard Crouch, which is also in one generation with Professor Dick Robison. So we're basically continuing this discussion from generation to generation, make it really, really interesting for us to and get an update on the recent contemporary topic that we've been reading all over the news, right? So, but Professor Hadis very much into this topic and the book, and you can see we discussed it after 20 years. Maybe some of you haven't born yet at that time, but I was the one also doing my master program and also PhD, getting bored of citing him. Hadis again, Robison, Hadis, Robison, but showing how important the work is. I'm not going, so it's not really like I'm really into this topic because the writing of my dissertation and master thesis is very into that topic, right? Markus Mietzner, on the other hand, has been really focused on Indonesian politics as well, but from different perspectives, right? Very recent, he wrote a book about the coalition the president make, showing how it's very important to understand the political economy, but also very important to understand the context, the institution, and the agency. So again, we are basically going to discuss about different school of thought here. One is political economy, showing from this oligarchy thesis, and the other one is more kind of pluralist and agency point of view. So if you're not familiar, 10 years ago, the same discussion was held in Sydney, if I'm not mistaken, came out as a book called Beyond Oligarchy, right? At the time, the book was edited by Michel Ford and Thomas Pepinski, basically trying to kroyok. What's kroyok in English? Trying to discuss this topic, but against oligarchy thesis, right? So which is very, very lively. And if you read the book, it's very lively, and you can really see where each of the strand of a theory coming from. Markus Mietzner also contribute there by. Oh, you're not there. Okay, so you're not kroyok Pak Vedi sama Dick. But Markus wrote about plurality of the actors, including activists, politicians, who also try to, in an intellectual debate, right? I underscore intellectual debate because it's very important for us here, 20 years, discussing after the first book published in 2004. Without further ado, let's give a floor Pak Vedi, and let's give applause first. Supaya semangat.
Thank you, Linda, for those words. Well, for those of you expecting a row between Marcus and I think we've already made a pact that whatever happens, we're going to have whiskey tonight, aren't we? So 20 years after reorganizing power, how do we assess the bloody thing that weighs on my neck like an albatross now, because everybody keeps asking me about oligarchy? Okay, I mean, on the one hand, it provided something to the lexicon of Indonesian political studies, right? Everybody now uses oligarchy, but they use it in different ways. And that is, I think, a bit of a problem because there's a lack of precision in the use of that term oligarchy. I mean, now I see oligarch, pointing their finger at other oligarchs. So you're an oligarch and all that. So the thing is, I think that as a concept, we might discuss it, whether it's still useful and so on. And but on the other hand, I think we need to think about, well, I mean, the book was written 20 years ago, so there's lots of things that, of course, it didn't foresee, right? And how would an oligarchy thesis, sort of address some of the things that have occurred in Indonesia the last 20 years that hadn't occurred before? And I think that is what we need to be thinking of, towards the future, if we are, of agreement that there is some semblance, at least, of usefulness in the oligarchy thesis, right? So first of all, maybe it would be useful to actually clarify what Dick and I meant by oligarchy, which is actually very different from its sort of popular usage in the media and so on. When people say, Agwan's, thing is an oligarchic project, the same, but the thing is, the attack is coming from a different oligarchic faction, right? But the term oligarchy has become this pejorative thing where you actually, label somebody that and then they're bad, right? Now, the thing is, so it has this sort of accompaniment of particular ideas that have to do with rapaciousness and so on. And in actuality, the way it's being used, in the sense of it's connected with rapacity and greed and so on, is actually, you might as well use the word plutocracy, which is ruled by the rich, right? Ruled by the few people who are rich. And I find that the way that oligarchy tends to be used in the popular media and so on is in that sense, which is not the sense that Dick and I conceived of it. And also, it is different, I might add, and I'll talk about this a bit, is it's different from the way Geoffrey Winters also discussed it in his 2011 book, I think, initially. So, a few years after our book came out, he came out with a book called Oligarchy. And now the big difference here is that, following up on what Dick said earlier, is that our understanding of oligarchy is that it is a structured, social relationship of power. A structured social relationship of power, which means that it is an underlying element within a broader social order, right? Rather than thinking about, well, here's an oligarch, that's an oligarch, and here's an oligarch, and what they do to defend their wealth as individuals. So, I don't want to, characterize Winters' work, but I mean, in his own admission, his work is at the level of individual oligarchs and their strategies of maintaining their wealth, right? And for him, the oligarchs are the rich people. Whereas for us, because it's a social relationship of power, it actually entails more than just that. It is about the fusion of politico-bureaucratic and economic power within an oligarchic or many oligarchic alliances. So it's about that fusion of politics, bureaucracy, and big capital. Okay, that is, I think, a major difference and is basically not reflected in the popular discussion about oligarchy because it's being used politically to put down people, whereas actually the people putting them down are part of that broader social structure and are part of those relationships that I'm talking about, right? And the other thing that we pointed out is that oligarchy, this goes to a question that emerged later, is not the opposite of democracy. Oligarchy can coexist with democracy because democracies can be dominated by oligarchic interests, right? So in our book, we suggested that a politico-bureaucratic big business oligarchy incubated under the New Order encountered a crisis in 97, 98, right? Which then resulted in the unraveling of the institutions of the New Order, but that the fundamental power relations that had become the basis of that authoritarian structure actually survived. So, and this is where, we often get, criticism because people, think that we suppose, people think that we emphasize the continuity aspect there. But I think it is important to have an understanding that the New Order was not a complete rupture with the past. Its unraveling was not a complete rupture with the past. In many ways, of course, it was. In that, for example, I was telling, who was I telling the other day, that one of the great results of Reformasi is that my articles in Kompas are no longer censored. I mean, because, in the old New Order period, I would be writing in Kompas and then they'd edit it and then I'd read it and I wouldn't understand what I'd written. At least now when I write in Kompas, they don't do that. Maybe they'll, correct me grammatically and so on, but they don't change the meaning, right? That, for me, personally, is the great outcome of Reformasi. Point we made is that the old oligarchic interests survived that cataclysm, right? And because, and this we borrowed Gramsci, whose idea was that social orders can, experience a crisis and they can falter, but if there is nothing to fill that interregnum, right, then you get a prolonged period of, basically political stagnation. But we then actually, built on that, I suppose, and suggested that, well, actually, that period of stagnation, at least for me, lasted about 6 months. In that, I happened to have been here in 98, and I remember thinking and writing very unpopularly that Reformasi was dead at around 1999. In that, I was suggesting that the old forces had begun a successful colonization of the institutions of democratic rule. And this proceeded, I think, all the way down to the early 2000s. I might have called it a bit too early, but I think the point stands that nothing actually filled the interregnum. There was nothing in civil society, right, that could actually make use of that void in power. So the old forces reconstituted themselves, reinvented themselves as democrats. So I remember, growing up, watching TV, hearing this guy being interviewed, and he talks about democracy, reformasi, and so on in the year 2000. I remember that in 1997, he was talking about Suharto as the father of development and that sort of thing, right? So there's been this reinvention, and through the process of colonization of the institutions of democracy, it has become possible for oligarchy to coexist with democracy. They're not opposite. Okay? Now, to go maybe to the criticisms another important point is that even though we thought that there was this reconstitution, we did not think that it reconstituted in the same way. We in the book we wrote that power became more fragmented. That the old new order system of patronage with Suharto at the apex no longer existed. That you had competing patronage networks, and often they were represented by, predatory alliances that shifted very quickly and were often expressed by political parties. In that political parties, therefore, did not come together on the basis of ideology, programs, policies, and so on, but because of exigencies having to do with using the instruments of democracy to control or gain access to the institutions, or to public institutions and their resources for the purposes of private accumulation. That's what we mean by predatory. Okay? So these old forces took over political parties, etc., and they used this to gain control of public resources and institutions for the purposes of private accumulation, to enrich themselves. So with all of these, with a more fragmented system, then you have intra-oligarchic conflict. And Dick was talking about this. What you have really over in Indonesia the last 20 years is intra-oligarchic conflict, not challenges to the oligarchy, not fundamental challenges to the oligarchy. Okay? Now, to get to the criticisms of our thesis, the main criticism is that where's the people? Where's the agency? Well, I've tried to explain this many times over 20 years, and apparently I've failed. But what we've tried to actually convey is simply, again, borrowing from somebody else, this time a famous German who will remain unnamed. Humankind, right? Humankind is able to make its own history, but it doesn't do so under circumstances of its own choosing. So they inherit the legacies of the past. You don't start from a clean slate, right? So from this point of view, social agents, have to cope with a particular social, economic, political environment. It's not that they're not able to do anything, as we've often been accused of saying. It's that they're not able to do anything they want. That's the key. They're not able to do anything they want. They have to work within the parameters of oligarchy and according to the logic of power dictated by it. Of course, there'll be fractures and there'll be conflict between oligarchs where there'll be room to maneuver and so on. And that is where agents, social agents may take advantage of things. But up to now, in these 20 years, we do not see that these fractures, these inter-oligarchy conflicts, these crises have resulted in internal or external fundamental challenges to that oligarchy structure. Okay? So it's not a matter of, nobody can do anything. Yes, you can, but you just can't do anything you want. Okay? Now, one of the most vociferous critics of our thesis is my old friend, Bill Little. And Bill has argued that rather than understanding structures of oligarchy, social structures of power, and so on, it is more useful to understand the decisions of politicians and policymakers. And this goes back to his old article in the 80s about the relative autonomy of the third world politician, I think, yeah? But for us, this sort of understanding about, how leaders can make policies and so on is the kind of understanding where somebody, social agents can do anything they want. Even leaders can't just do anything they want. We saw this with Jokowi, for example, where he had to make alliances with the existing, sort of social forces. And Marcus interpreted it in a particular way. I think in some ways, in significant ways, differently than we have, but still, it's acknowledged that they have to work within, a structure and constellation of social forces that already exists, right? So in terms of the intellectual genealogy of these sorts of ideas, of extreme agency, it really goes to something that is, sort of akin to, sort of American rational choice theory, which frankly, we do not have much sympathy for. So with all due respect to Bill, I don't think he and I will ever agree on this, okay? Because of the different way we understand agency. I think more serious and constructive criticism have come from, from Marcus and from another old friend, Edward Aspinall. And Ed's idea really is that that the new order power structure fragmented, right? So that you have different kinds of patronage networks working, and they work in different ways, and that this gives the possibility for the development of sort of alternative power centers, right? And he's hoping it'll come out from civil society, maybe the media, NGOs, and so on. Now, the thing is, I don't think Dick either, don't have a problem with the idea of, the fragmentation of power. In fact, it's key to what we said before. But I think the difference between myself and Dick and Ed is that there is a tendency in Ed's work to think of these alternative centers of power as having a position in the competition with oligarchic interests, which is greater than they have. Which goes to, I think, the influence of liberal pluralist, political theory, where the idea is to look at, well, you have different sources of social power. How do they compete with each other in making, in decision making and the creation of policy? Well, whilst we might, agree that there are different kinds of power centers, we do actually think of them as not being of equal standing. Far from it. We think that, for the most part, these so-called alternative power centers have to work still within the structures of oligarchy and are subordinated to the logic of oligarchic power. And therefore, you do see a lot of cooptation, you do see a lot of ineffectiveness, and you see a lot of, what is it? Sometimes trying to sit behind the back or ride the coattails of particular oligarchs, right? But then getting nothing in return for civil society, because the standing, the bargaining position is just too low, right? I think that's where we differ from liberal pluralist theory, where there tends to be this idea of competition between different power centers and all that. But we don't think that these power centers are equal standing at all. Okay, and Meet Marcus's latest work, which I've read, is, I think, a really good analysis of the way that institutions work, particularly the institution of the presidency, how it itself becomes this sort of magnet for the development of political coalitions that, according to Marcus, it does not always have to be subordinated to the dictates of oligarchy. So in his book, it's, forgive me if I'm making a caricature, but it's, basically Jokowi versus oligarchy, whereas I think that Jokowi was part of the oligarchy. Okay, and that negotiation and so on that Marcus explained, while happening, actually, rather than depicting, the relative autonomy of the presidency, depicts the opposite, that even the presidency has to work according to the dictates of oligarchy. So, in other words, I think there are, issues that have come up from these criticisms and so on, which I think would contribute to sort of refining and thinking about oligarchy in a more, way that can be more applicable to current situations. But, just dealing with the major sort of criticisms that have come about with us, I think that those criticisms can be accommodated within the, thesis that we have put forward, without there being necessarily a row between me and Marcus. Okay. What else? I've lost my train of thought. Therefore, I have to look at my notes. So again, I've mentioned fragmentation. That isn't something that we don't acknowledge. It happens, but it's part of intra-oligarchy conflict. Civil society, and I know this is noise a lot of my friends, but I think that the problem, again, is that there is a tendency to look at civil society from a liberal pluralist standpoint, where civil society, is expected to be the womb of liberal democratic, sort of tendencies and so on. But in our analysis, and I think this needs further analysis, a civil society is not monolithic at all. It is very, very diverse. There are very diverse interests within civil society. They're not just about progressive NGOs and media and so on, but also the FPI and the FBR and Pemuda Pancasila. These are civil society groups as well. Sorry? The Ku Klux Klan in America is a very old civil society group. The Nazis in Germany started out as a civil society group. Okay, so there is nothing inherently progressive, liberal about civil society, which is the Gramscian rather than the Tocquevillian idea of civil society. Okay? I'm told I only have 5 minutes. Was that 5 hours or 5 minutes? Okay. So what is it though? I said that, well, what is it that we might, have to think about that we couldn't have foreseen, 20 years ago? Well, I think one of the things is, which we didn't handle very, I think, deeply, is the rise of populism expressed as identity politics. Right. I mean, this came out, in the early 2000s and then 2010s and so on. That I've written about Islamic populism, but there are, nationalist variants of populism as well. How this fits in to the oligarchic, sort of framework and so on is something that probably needs analysis. But my tentative conclusion really is something that Dick, or maybe the logical culmination of what Dick mentioned before, that there is also no contradiction necessary between oligarchy and populism. In fact, in many cases, populism is just the other side of the coin of oligarchy. Because populist policies are used to bolster and support oligarchic rule. So, for example, I think, and I'll be interested to hear what Marcus says about it, I think that Prabowo right now is in his populist phase. He's giving out free food and so on and so forth, right? He's reinventing himself from, this dastardly general and so on, to this nice, cuddly old grandpa. Sorry? And cat. But the thing is, why is he doing this? He's doing this because he needs to develop a popular base of support that will be relatively independent of Jokowi. And Pak Kodari is helping with that. Because that is just the next level of conflict, really. Because he would need to have his cronies supplant Jokowi's cronies. That is just the logic of intra-oligarchic competition. So again, so it's just the other side of oligarchy. I think from the 2010s, the use of social media, internet technology, buzzers, and so on, we didn't think about that. But I have, students who have worked and still work on these issues, and how this can challenge or become absorbed into oligarchic structures. Yes, Pak Adori, is something to be talked about as well, right? Another thing I think is, well, there's a few things. I think, people like Marcus and Ed and Eve Warburton, I think, have contributed to working out the details of how oligarchy works, including at the local level. And I think that's very valuable. But I don't think it contradicts thesis, right? And I think more work needs to be done about that. I think that we probably didn't think about the effect of the rise of China on sort of political, bureaucratic, and capitalist sort of alliances and their permutations. Tricia may be thinking about these sorts of things. But the main thing I'd like to say, okay, and I don't have any more time, is this. In order to bring this forward, and again, I hope I don't annoy too many people, but when I wrote this with Dick, from my part, one of the things that really, really riled me was the literature on democratic transitions and consolidations. That really riled me. And this, on my part, this was an intervention critiquing the fundamentals of that particular school of thought. So instead of democratic consolidations, transitions and consolidations, which is understood usually in the liberal democratic sense, what Dick and I were talking about is illiberal consolidations. So when we're talking about democratic regression and so all that in Indonesia, for us, it is not a deviation from the norm where a trajectory was, being headed towards liberal democracy. It is just the logical culmination of a trajectory that was heading towards illiberal democracy. It was a deepening of the liberal democracy, and hence I would say that the end of the Jokowi period has seen, right? Finally, it should have buried and murdered and buried the whole discussion about democratic transitions. And we should now be thinking about the entrenchment of political illiberalism and oligarchy and what it means for the future. I have more, but then again, what the hell? Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Is this too low? I'm sorry. All right, yeah. Okay, all good. All right, so the first thing to say, of course, is congratulating Dick and Vedi for this major milestone. I think it is a testament to their influence that we're convening here today to celebrate the 20th anniversary of their book. Both of them have succeeded in what few academics succeed in, and that is establishing a true school of thought within the attempt to interpret Indonesian politics. As you mentioned earlier, Vedi, it's very hard to write about Indonesian politics these days without at least engaging with the oligarchy theory, the oligarchic analysis, and the work that Vedi and Dick have done on that. So congratulations again on that. Also looking around the room, you will find another and probably the most important legacy of that book, and that is the output of the regeneration program, so to speak, of Vedi and Dick. So many students have gone through the so-called Murdoch School, which now has physically relocated to Melbourne, of course, but let's, as shorthand, let's still refer to the Murdoch School. But again, that is a great sign of the intellectual power of what has been achieved here. And then, of course, we have to acknowledge that the 2004 book was in many ways predictive. And we will come to the differences later on. But of course, everybody would have to agree, looking at Indonesian elite politics today, that the number of oligarchs in government is higher than it ever was before. And I take Dick's point that the presence of oligarchs in government is not necessarily an indicator of their power, but I do think it is interesting that oligarchs who for so many decades, in fact, in Indonesia have operated behind the scenes are now openly leading political parties, are ministers themselves. In the past, it was often the practice to leave that to some of their assistants, and they would pull the strings from behind. But any kind of inhibitions that oligarchs would have had about this sort of public display of their presence is now gone. It's also, of course, and it has been written about, including by my colleague Ed Espinel, true that money, funds, resources are now a precondition for electoral participation, more so than it was in 1999, and probably still sort of in 2004 when you guys were writing. I think it was still possible for people to lead credible campaigns, at least at the legislative level, without having major resources. We are now at a time, and you are all aware of the numbers that people have to raise in terms of the funds in order to have any credible chance of getting elected. So it's either you have personal wealth on your own, and this is how we have seen the number of business people actually increasing in parliament, or you borrow money in order to run, and then you make yourself beholden to your sponsors, and then represent that in parliament. So all of that, of course, has happened. And again, I think there's very little disagreement between us on these tendencies, and all of that, again, I think was in a way predicted in the 2004 work. Now, and again, taking Dick's point about the compatibility between oligarchy and democracy, and in a way also liberal democracy, but it has also, of course, occurred in a way that I think is embedded in your 2004 book, that the quality of liberal democracy, I mean, there was never really a liberal democracy in Indonesia. I don't want to plant that idea in your head, but at least there was an attempt in the early 2000s to move towards that goal. But by all accounts, and especially the international democracy indexes, Indonesia's democracy, liberal democracy, the kind of liberal democratic values that are normally measured by these indexes, they have declined across the board for the last 15 years or so. So all of that, I think, was in the way it was structurally caused by the oligarchic survival of structures from the new order. All of that has, of course, occurred. Now, of course, I was not invited here to praise the oligarchy theory, so I assume I was expected to provide some spice here, so I hope I don't disappoint. So and Vedi has sort of laid out some of the differences between us, some of which I agree with, some of which I don't. But the major difference is indeed that we are looking at oligarchy in a different way. And you just heard me saying that I believe no other social group of actors in Indonesian politics has gained so much in power over the last 20 years as the oligarchs. So in that, we agree. However, in what Dick Robison would refer to as the pluralist school of thought, in a way, and it's not a compliment. It is an attempt to describe the ANU school, or whatever else school is behind that kind of thinking, Indonesian politics still as an arena of contestation in which various groups compete for power. And I agree with Vedi that not all powers are equal. The powers that these various institutions, these various groups, these social actors, veto powers can bring to bear differ a lot. But I think where we differ is that we still view the arena as a multiple actor arena. And in that arena, the oligarchs are probably the most important player at the moment, but yet they have to compete with many other forces for power. And Vedi has referred to my book, and so I need to clarify a little bit about what this was about. So it does look at the power of the Indonesian presidency, but most importantly, as well as it's reflected in the title, its limits. And the limits are, and this is what Dick and Vedi would describe as the oligarchy, but what I would describe as the various powers that these actors can bring to bear, and they differ. So the oligarchs in my book is actually one chapter. So the book is structured by actors. So I describe how the various actors in this big competition of Indonesian politics limit the power of the presidency. Whether that is the military, whether that is the police, whether it is Muslim organizations, whether it's the bureaucracy itself, and yes, oligarchs. The oligarchs, and again, in my analysis of the last 20 years, there's no other group that has increased its participation in government as much as the oligarchs have. And generally, they are the winners. If you want to put it very casually, they are the winners of the last 20 years of that kind of contestation. So each of those chapters in the book describes what powers the presidency can bring to bear, and they are substantial. But at every turn, the presidents have to take account of the powers that these various actors bring to the table. And they are drawing their red lines, and they're saying to the president, well, if you step across that red line, then we consider withdrawing support for your presidency. So the way I have conceptualized it, again, is Indonesian power coalitions as these very broad alliances that actually go beyond just political parties, which is what the normal presidentialism studies do. But in Indonesia, a lot of non-party actors, non-legislative actors are included as well. So it's a giving and taking in order to stabilize the system, and the stability of that system has been remarkable for the last 20 years. Not a single impeachment attempt towards an Indonesian president, and that means that whether it was Yudhoyono, whether it was Jokowi, they have made the compromises that was necessary in order to stabilize their rule. And every actor has a different red line. Right? For the military, for instance, 1965 is something presidents should not touch. And Yudhoyono, of course, for his personal interest, but especially Jokowi, who initially tried to do something about talking about 1965, then withdrew on that issue because otherwise the military would have destabilized his government. And so you can run through the various red lines that these actors have. So that's just to put my book into the proper context. But now let's come to the oligarchy theory, and Vedi has already, I think, quite well described where our differences are. So for Dick and Vedi, oligarchy is a system of power relations that enables the wealth defense, the collective wealth defense in that system itself. Now, that is a powerful definition, but for me, it is also problematic because it is so all-encompassing. If actors in that system are all somehow implicated in a system of oligarchy, if they're all either actors of oligarchy or are collaborating with oligarchy, then focusing on the various motivations, the actions, the resources of individual players becomes quite difficult. And it does, so Vedi sort of dismissed this a little. I think it is important that we identify who are the oligarchs and who are not. And in that sense, actually, I found Jeffrey Winter's conceptualization superior in that aspect. Because I was about to say, and I've written about this, and he hated my review of his book. But in that respect, it was a clearer definition of who the oligarchic players actually are and who are non-oligarchic players. And let's come to that question. Jokowi. Was Jokowi an oligarch? Was he a puppet of the oligarchs? That all becomes unclear in an analysis of a system in which everyone is somehow a servant of oligarchic interests. I have, and this will be my next book. It's a long story, but end of the year I'll have a book out on Jokowi, and I have wrestled with that question. I've wrestled with it in the Cornell book, which Vedi talked about as well, but even more so in the book that's coming out, and which is based on a year of interviews with Jokowi and some of the players in his surrounding. Yes, Jokowi made alliances with the oligarchs, and as Dick and Vedi rightly posit, he had to, and every president who comes in has to make these compromises. But again, was he a puppet? I would say no. And you would just have to talk to some of these oligarchs who have become his victims, who would testify to the power that Jokowi perfected over the decade in power, to discipline them, to exclude them from things, to make them do what he wanted them to do. And what we then have is a much more nuanced picture. Jokowi made huge concessions to the oligarchs, there's no doubt about that. But he did it in a way that the power he gave away was sectoral. Jokowi didn't care about many sectors of Indonesian politics, and he surrendered them to oligarchic interests because they gave him something in return. They gave him resources, they gave him support, and the oligarchs were even coerced into supporting projects they had absolutely no interest in, and the most important one, of course, would be IKN, where literally they were coerced into building projects that they thought were doomed to fail and were deeply not lucrative in a sense. But they had to, because Jokowi was able to bring these powers to bear. And so the way, again, I understand these power relations between presidents, if they play their cards well, and the oligarchs, is one of give and take, right? So this is largely, in a structural sense, our difference. I acknowledge the rising power of oligarchy and the damage it has done to the health of the Indonesian political system, but not everyone in Indonesian politics is an oligarch. I think analytically, and not everybody is entangled in this large network of oligarch. Not everybody is a servant of oligarchy. And I think we need to have that, pluralist view on Indonesian politics in order to understand where the differences actually are in the various motivations. Now, my final point, and then again, unfortunately, in fact, I have to agree with Dick and Vedi, more so than I probably would have had 5 or 10 years ago. But I do think that the opportunities for major political change within the current status quo are rather limited. And that has to do with the oligarchs, but the oligarchs, I think, again, just a major part of the puzzle of illiberal democracy in Indonesia, which is taking hold at the moment. Again, the fact that we're speaking here today, 27 years after the regime change, and Prabowo is president. Again, you look at how the it does tell you something about the state of Indonesian democracy, and it tells you something about the declining power of progressive civil society. Fully agree with you, and I've always make this point, never really successfully, with many people when I say, FPI is civil society. All, Laskar Jihad was civil society. But there is, in the traditional literature on civil society, this implicit notion that somehow civil society is necessarily progressive, and that's not the case. So what we have, however, seen in Indonesia is that the progressive elements of civil society have fragmented, have become weaker. They have joined political actors in many ways across an ideological divide. There were the other pluralists, so the term pluralist in Indonesia is actually often used to describe NGOs or so who are defending the pluralist identity of Indonesia in a religious and ideological sense. These NGOs that often in the past would have at the same time been progressive, they have over time, many of them, not all of them, but really many of them have decided that it is more important to defend pluralism against the Islamists than to uphold civil liberties, for instance. And so once Jokowi started to clamp down on Islamism in 2016, 2017, by issuing a presidential decree, for instance, that allowed him, without a court ruling, to ban social organizations, many of these pluralist NGOs applauded. And so we now have a quite weak, a quite fragmented, a quite, collaborative civil society that indeed has very little prospect at the moment of shaking the status quo. And again, I'll finish up with this last sentence, again agreeing with Vedi. I think without a major economic shock from outside, without a major crisis that really shakes the foundations of the status quo, we will see more of the same, because what Jokowi has succeeded in doing is undermining democratic values over time systematically, but doing so in a way without the population even noticing. Indonesians are vastly supportive and appreciative of the way democracy is practiced in Indonesia. And that means he has hit the sweet spot for anybody who wants to be in this position to increase their own power, reduce democratic accountability, but actually doing all of that with a happy population. And I think that's exactly what Prabowo is trying to replicate at the moment. And if we're looking at the current polls, it's working very well.
Thank you, Vedi and Marcus, for this very engaging debate. Before I give to the floor, let me, as a moderator, as a host, to use my privilege asking question to both of them. Privilege is very important. Pak Vedi, I agree and I echo Marcus' point on how this definition is very much all-encompassing and make it really difficult. For instance, if I supervise students, it's really difficult if they always want to have a oligarchy theory, right? But when come into the methodology part, like what do you mean by, right? Because you mentioned about the system of wealth accumulation, right? You addressed also, Pak Dik, underscore this dimension of system, right? So, but then system become, methodologically speaking, it need to focus on so many varieties, like the system of banking, the system of this and the system of that. So from my own reflection on this theory, supervising students, that's really kind of struggle, because that's why I think I agree with echoing Marcus' point on this very, 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 very broad definition, as well as I'm a pluralist, so that I will come to that. That's one note. And the other one is, I feel like this oligarchy theory become oligarchy 2.0, which basically travel whatever they want to define, including in a popular term, right? So coming from the different like social movement, it's very important for the social movement to pinpoint who are our enemy, which is basically, they will say oligarchy, but what they mean sometimes is the rich who are make use of power and accumulate more wealth, and then use that basically like what you suggest, but it's not really in a more complicated definition, but it just need to have some common ground to react upon, you know. So, and then, you know, recently we all read news about pagar di mana? Pagar laut. We also learned that campus will have concession on the tambang, on the mining, for the batubara, for the coal mining, including UI and UGM, I don't know, but that's really a new reality that we all face, and it's really difficult not to connect them with the oligarchy theory, right? Campus, for instance, my God, you know, taking care of student already give a headache, and now taking care of the concession of coal mining, that's another level of how campus become co-opted, right, by the regime. So that's really kind of the way oligarchy theory is defined. It's really situated within a certain context, including the social movement that, as you said, and you and Marcus said, that is getting really fragmented and weak. But in a way, it always needs some common ground to fight for. That's really what I can tell from the way I understand many friends or a movement trying to, you know, using this term in their strategy. But coming to the question, Pak Vedi, we heard that, you know, this is a very massive efficiency right now going on in Prabowo, right? Excluding military and police sector. Would you give some comment on, will, compared to New Order, also the military regime, right? Also with lots of budget. Will it be kind of imitating that pattern during the New Order, culminated by military, with the increasing pattern of, you know, security institution, including police and military, in relation to your thesis on oligarchy? Will it actually continuing what is happening, or there will be, as Marcus said, a lot of things going on there, a lot of things that the actors, you know, the exchange between various actors, who will get this makan siang gratis project, you know, like 800 million per day, just to connect it with your theory on, you know, oligarchy thesis.
Well, that was quite a lot. No, I liked all of them. It's just that, you know, I'm sort of even more senile than Dick is, even though I'm younger than he is. So remind me if I forget something. But you know, because it's easier to remember the last one. Look, I think that if he had a choice, and even you know, even those at the top of the, you know, oligarchic power structure can't do anything, just about anything that they want. But if he had a choice, he would go back to as close as the New Order that he could. I mean, the difference between him and Jokowi in 2014 was about the re-centralization of power, or maintaining, you know, the sort of more decentralized structure from which Jokowi emerged. Jokowi had a vested interest in maintaining this more fragmented, decentralized system of power, because that's where he came from. It would not have been possible for him to come up, even though, you know, I think it was not acknowledged enough that he did so, you know, with lots of oligarchic assistance, right? Now, I think that in spite of those aspirations, though, it would be difficult to go back to the New Order because there are just too many vested interests now in Indonesian democracy. I mean, the thing is, if you ask the political parties and so on, if the military came in as big a way as they were during the New Order, what would this mean in the sense of the material base of these parties? They'd have to share it with the military. And this is something they don't want to do, right? But clearly, you know, there is an impetus, you know, coming out of Prabowo, because you know, re-centralization, you know, to the extent that it's possible, requires coercion. And the instruments of coercion are the military and the police. So we already see that there's more, military sort of involvement in civil affairs than there ever was. Even though Jokowi opened the door to it, really, I think in many ways, Jokowi opened the door for Prabowo. Yeah, right. And that's right. And Prabowo is actually exploiting as much as possible the opportunities that were given to him by Jokowi. So, can you remind me of the second question?
The multiplication of oligarchy in the rich among the activists.
Okay, this. Okay, so the criticism that Marcus put forward, and you said you disagree with, is that our idea of oligarchy is the reason that it. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Okay, so the reason that it is so all-encompassing is that oligarchy is all-encompassing. That it's bloody everywhere. Hold on, if it wasn't all-encompassing, as we suggested, let's say 10 years or 15 years ago, it certainly is now. So I think that you were talking about, well, what does the progressive, how would the progressive movement deal with this? Who would they identify as the enemy of all that? Well, the first thing I think is not to get sucked in to intra-oligarchy conflict, where, for example, right now people are going, oh, attack Agwan. I mean, he's a bastard, but the people who are attacking him are also bastards. And therefore, you shouldn't be thinking that, oh, Agwan is an oligarch, so let's attack. And by the way, the subtext here is Chinese capital and the Chinese. And I expect really that there'll be a lot more of this racist thing, discourse coming out, also because of Prabowo's background. Yeah, even though he wants Chinese investment. So the first thing to understand is you are dealing with a socio-economic political structure, not just with individuals. Because if you don't think that way, you can get sucked in to these intra-oligarchy conflicts without you knowing it. Right? Now, the easy thing, quote unquote, about 1998 was, it was clear who was at the apex of the oligarchic structure. There was Suharto. Once he was gone, it became unclear because there is no apex. Right? And this is one of the things that I think has contributed to the disorientation and the sort of strategizing, lack of, problem strategizing in, among civil society. In February 2024, I went to a civil society meeting in which everybody was saying, let's overthrow Jokowi. I said, no, this is before the Adili Jokowi, overthrow Jokowi. And I said, the guy's got 75% approval ratings. How are you going to overthrow him? I said that more realistically, you should think about that Prabowo will win next week, and how are you going to deal with that? But this short-sightedness because of a kind of fixation with individuals and so on, I think, has a cost in terms of thinking strategically.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes left. 15. Okay. 3 questions and only 1 question, if I may. I will cut you if you have start speaking. So 1 in front, Bapak. 1 in the back. Any women? Any girls? Ya, yang laki-laki mana ya? Lucky udah lah, nanya mulu. Gantian. 1 in the back, 1. Yang sudah bertanya mungkin gantian ya. Let's just have another opportunity. So I'm a bit authoritarian here. Maybe 1 in front. Okay. If any women question, yang lagi perempuan boleh ya nanti ya round kedua. Singkat, padat, satu pertanyaan.
Okay. Yeah, I'll make this quick. Thank you. My name is Edward. So basically my question is that is the oligarchs having a Pyrrhic victory right now? Because is there a contradiction between capital accumulation and the political stability that's happening with the oligarchs right now? Because we have a huge coalition. Because do we actually have the means to accumulate capital? And this relates to the public crisis that's going on. Is this going to be the next crisis? That's all. Thank you.
You got it? Okay. Second, Bapak yang di depan, boleh Pak?
Thank you very much. My name is Yuri Tamrin. I used to serve as ambassador of Indonesia to UK, to Belgium, and European Union. I used to go to the same faculty, FESIP UI, with Vedi. Vedi belonged to batch 81. I belong to batch 79. Okay. One day he sent me his article, and I like his article very much. It underlines that oligarchy is everywhere, in the US, in Australia, and Indonesia. Okay. Now in the US, we have one of the big oligarch being there as a president, right? Okay. When we have electoral presidential election in the US, what we have is really Kamala Harris being backed by financial oligarch and Trump by mining and IT oligarch. But you know, as he mentioned, oligarchy structure has dominated the system, and it makes people feel unhappy because they are not happy living in that lopsided system. Okay.
Maaf Pak, boleh langsung
Now
pertanyaan?
my question. Sorry. My question. I have two questions because we are friends. We are old friends, right? What is the difference of oligarchy there in the US and in Indonesia? That's one question. And second question, very short. Do you perceive relations between oligarchs will help bilateral relations? You know, when I read newspaper and I read about Lido being disturbed, and we realized that Trump investment are there, how it's going to affect relationship? Again, those my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Boleh yang depan? Ini.
Okay, thank you. I'm Guru. I'm from trade union, syndicate trade union. I'm asking about Professor Vedi, you explained that alternative power forces have failed to contest the oligarchy system to work outside the parameter because of the cooptation and fragmented and the short seeing. And I'm curious how you explain what's the crux of the social movement what's the crux, the main problem of the social movement to find or to explore new spaces outside the parameter already set by the oligarchs.
Yeah.
I'm interested with how you explained the failure of the labor movement to consolidate like in several days ago. Because it's easy if you just say it's because of fragmented, because of the unconsolidated, but why they fail to consolidate?
Thank you.
The first question there, concentration of wealth and oligarchy, will it result in crisis? I mean, you would think so. But the thing is, the world is more unequal than it ever has been. All the biggest economies in the world today are much more unequal than they were 40, 50 years ago. Right? I mean, depending on, which sort of sources of data you go to, but, a few years ago, the World Bank was saying that 1% of Indonesians control 49% of the wealth. I read this morning that 0.5% of Americans control 30% of the wealth. So you would think so, but I actually have problems with automatist kinds of perspectives. Just because you have repression, there will be resistance. Doesn't happen automatically. You may have resistance, but it may be ineffective resistance. Okay? So I think that it is actually possible for the oligarchy to continue the further concentration of wealth in Indonesia. And one of the things that we didn't talk about is that I think, and this is potentially sort of important, is that the material base of the Indonesian oligarchy, the main material base, lies in the mining sector, right? Which is linked up to supply chains and so on. Yeah. And so the thing about China and the US American, yeah, that all comes into that, right? But one other thing that's happening in the mining sector, and I owe this this revelation to Eve actually, is that she was saying that there's and I think another ANU person who was saying that a lot more people from business, especially the mining sector, are going directly into politics. Right. And that is a kind of change. Although in the Suharto period, you had Bopasan, you had Tutut, but this is something that is quite different. Right. So what are the implications of that in the future? I think we need to think about that. And one of the things that I do kind of fear, and I hope that, look, otherwise now, I don't know how to formulate this because I don't want to give consultancy to these people. But really, a lot of these guys are quote unquote pribumi. If I were them and I wanted to push myself, up the scales of power and be able to mobilize, society to help me go up there to fight the Aguans and Lim Swee Leongs, I would underline that. And then we'd get into identity politics more, sort of strongly into intra-oligarchy conflict. Okay, yeah. With that, your question about the difference between American and Indonesian oligarchy is, I think that, first of all, the American oligarchy is more diverse because the economy is just more sophisticated and more diverse than Indonesia's. Secondly, and this is really, Trump is testing this, right? Compared to Indonesia, I would say that in the past, at least, the American oligarchy could ride roughshod over everything in ways that I think was still not comparable to Indonesia. In that, you did have, some semblance of civil society movements. Not like in Europe, perhaps, right? Some semblance of a free press and so on and so forth, right? And that acted as a kind of, sort of break on what can be done. But now, with the colonization of, a section of the oligarchy, of the media, of civil society groups, and sort of permeating through everywhere, we'll see. So what's happening really is not that Indonesian democracy is going more and more like American democracy, but it's the opposite. American democracy is looking more and more like Indonesian democracy. All right. So, and the last question was, so the thing about the labor movement, I did deal with on, international relations, are they help? The thing is, first of all, I'm not an international relations realist in that I don't believe that countries are actors. I think that you need to understand the dominant kinds of social interests and coalitions that drive policy, including international trade policy, etc., in different countries, right? From that point of view, oligarchic domination in A and B, yeah, might coalesce if there is an interest, in coalescing. But just because they're both oligarchs doesn't mean that they will always, that there will be that correlation of interests, right? It depends on the material base of the oligarchies, respective oligarchies. Okay, yeah, okay. So it's not automatic again. So on the labor movement, I discussed this on Friday. I'm not sure whether you were there, but look, with the social movement, in social movements in general, I think that, like in many other societies, one of the problems with having alliances of different kinds of social movements is that society has become more and more diverse. And so the interests of the components of society have become more and more diverse. So trying to identify commonalities between different, like, middle-class professionals and the peasantry is difficult, right? So it's not a question of, just fragmentation, but the fragmentation actually reflects the social base of these social movements, which is diverse. And the other thing, to go back to, the idea that we assume, now, 1 minute, we assume that, civil society groups, including labor groups, will be progressive. On Friday, I mentioned that my research into labor, so talking to workers, not workers activists, but to workers in both Indonesia, and I said my comparative work was in Turkey, was that generally workers are socially conservative. And therefore, a lot of the militant progressive jargon that labor organizers spout don't actually resonate with workers. They go, what the hell is this? Okay.
Okay, you want to say something quickly? So you have extra 5 minutes.
Just to the question earlier, have the oligarchs now won and so forth. I do think, again, we need to look at the specific context now of the Prabowo presidency. Now, again, my colleague Ed Espinal 10 years ago described Prabowo as a oligarchic populist, right? And so, of course, his brother is an oligarch and so forth, and there's a lot of people that are attached to Prabowo. It's easy to conclude it's another step up for oligarchic power. But Vedi was absolutely right at the beginning when he said what Prabowo is doing at the moment is actually almost the opposite from that. He is giving in to a lot of populist demands. He's focusing on a project, the lunch project, which they internally understand as a massive economic redistribution project in order to increase its popularity. The issue with the Aguan's fence is very interesting, and I actually don't think this was an intra-oligarchic problem. This was an issue that everybody internally in the government understood was happening, but then when it broke to the media and it became an issue of sovereignty, it became an issue of, does the state control its waters? Prabowo felt compelled to intervene and play the populist who says, no, we can't have that. Although, again, internally, it was a very different project. So I don't think this was an anti-Aguan oligarch or a Pribumi oligarch trying to undermine Aguan's pet project. This was, again, something where Prabowo responded in a way that we have now become accustomed to, and that is, if it's unpopular, best drop it. And that's where we are at the moment. You've seen the tax increase, which would have been the added value tax increase, which would have been very important to his economic agenda in terms of getting more income. But he dropped it because there was the danger that it becomes unpopular for him. So again, we need to understand the Prabowo presidency also in its facets, in its nuances. The number one priority for Prabowo now, again, as Vedi indicated, is I need to be as popular as Jokowi, and I need to stay popular for as long as possible. Now he has a honeymoon, he's at 80%, but for how long will that stay? And so he will throw all he has into that. And if that means he takes on the oligarchs in some of the areas that are important to them, that he will also do.
Thank you, Marcus. Pak Dik, quickly. Pak Dik will have like last comment on.
I just want to say something very quickly. I think a lot of the discussion has been confused between oligarchs and oligarchy. Let me just ask one question. Why would I call Hungary an oligarchy, but Germany, which has huge numbers of very wealthy corporate conglomerates and rich people, I wouldn't call it an oligarchy. I might call it a plutocracy, but not an oligarchy. Why would I call countries in Southeast Asia, why would I be inclined to think of them increasingly in terms of oligarchies? But Japan, which has more rich and wealthy people and conglomerates and that, I wouldn't think of it as an oligarchy. And I think this points to the fact that we've got to look at something in power relations and structures and the way in which wealth and power operate, rather than focusing on rich people, whether we want to call them oligarchs or plutocrats or whatever. So that's the question. Why is Germany not an oligarchy, but Hungary is an oligarchy? Why is, say, Thailand, according to my friends, becoming really deeply oligarchic, but Japan, who has much more wealth and corporate power, not an oligarchy? That's the question. That's, I think, a question to ask. Well, I'm asking. I've said the answer is you have to look at the different. It's not only because there are rich people there. It's the way in which power and wealth are related in the particular social order, the way in which they are related. And I suppose you could say one is more structural than the other, but it's something, a way to get your teeth into and not be focused so much on talking about rich people. When you talk about oligarchs, you mean rich people. You talk about the system. And of course, if a country is an oligarchy, the implications for where it can go politically and economically are different to if it is, a country like, say, Germany or Japan.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Pak Dik. I'm sure you have still so many questions. So do I. Let's continue, approaching Pak Vedi or Pak Dik juga Marcus during the lunchtime, and we still have another session after lunch. But can you please join me again for a round of applause for our speaker? Thank you so much. I give back to the moderator.
Okay. Thank you so much. Please give another round of applause for our chair, speaker, and discussant. So for everyone, we just want to announce that we will have another session after break. So session 3 will begin at 1:30. We would really appreciate it if you could join us for our panel discussion at 1:30. And before we go, we would like to have a photo of our speakers. And yeah, sure.